Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2015 Global Dialogue on Waste. We're proud to be conducting our panel discussions consecutively for the third year to disseminate knowledge in waste management. As part of the 2015 Global Dialogue on Waste, we will host a panel discussion every Wednesday until December 18th. So we have two more panels coming up before the end of this year. A slight change from business as usual is that we're organizing a panel on Friday, the 18th of December, on the real potential for mitigating climate change through waste management. Our next panel will be on Wednesday, next Wednesday, which is December 16th, and we'll be discussing gender in waste management, and it'll be moderated by Lucia Fernandez. This is a very new topic for all of us, and it started majorly by pioneers at the organization WeGo. You can learn more about the time and other details of all upcoming panels by following us on social media or by subscribing to our newsletter. We welcome you to join this conversation with your questions and comments. You can use the live chat window on our homepage or tweet to us at BeWasteWise. If you're watching this video after its live broadcast, you can find recordings of all our panel discussions on our website, www.wastewise.be. Coming to today's topic, we have Christopher Lunn from Gershman, Brickner, and Bratton, or GBB. And today's topic, in a way, can be sourced back to a conversation Chris and I had a few years ago, so thanks to him for that. And we also have Michael Cowing, who's an environmental consultant with 30 years of experience in nearly 55 countries. He says Nigeria is his 55th country, and he just got back from a mission there. He also works with the Resources and Waste Advisory Group, RWA. So we'll start with introductions. We'll ask both panelists to talk a little bit about their work and themselves, how they got into the solid waste industry. So Chris, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. Good morning and half a day, as we would say in Guam. My experience in the Pacific Islands begins with Guam. For about 25 years now, I've worked in Guam on the island for 16 years, and then follow-up work over the last 8 years, where GBB has managed the solid waste program for the entire island. It was basically to get it back on track. So it's a comprehensive effort, managing the collection system, revamping the collection system, building a brand new Greenfields landfill for the island, the first one for Guam, and then closing their dump that had been there for 70 years. So that's been a lot of my experience over the last 8 years working in Guam.
Great. Thank you, Chris, for joining us today. And Mike, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good afternoon from the Eastern Caribbean, St. Lucia. Ranjith, I think you covered most of the points that pertain to me, but just in summary, I'm an environmental scientist who specializes in waste management, the whole chain of utility, from storage, transportation, final disposal, recycling, waste to energy, incineration, landfill. So I have a pretty broad spectrum in terms of waste management. As you mentioned, I've worked in many countries around the world: Africa, Asia, Caribbean, India. And my approach is pretty much field-based, in as much as I like to work on the ground with the communities and pretty much have a bottom-up approach and try and meet other practitioners who are working at the policy and planning level and meet somewhere in between. I think overall that gives us a more robust and pragmatic approach if we bring the communities with us in terms of the planning and the implementation of these various waste management projects.
Great. Thank you, Mike. And before we dive into the discussion, I think there really are two important distinctions that we should make. One is between islands, the differences in islands, and the second one is how islands are different from other land masses. So I think Chris, I'll get to you after Mike. I'll ask the first question to Mike, and then I'll get to you about the distinction between islands and differences between islands and the other land masses. So Mike, could you talk a little bit about the distinction that we should make here, when we're talking about Guam, the Caribbean, or let's say an island like Singapore?
Yeah, indeed. We touched upon that in our earlier preamble, and I think it's important to recognize, if we're talking about waste management in an island context, it certainly isn't one solution fits all. And as I've worked in diverse islands, developed islands such as Singapore, and also worked in the Caribbean, the Seychelles, the Maldives. So a fair experience in the islands, and it makes me appreciate, if we're talking Singapore, what works and what pertains in Singapore certainly wouldn't work in the Eastern Caribbean, where we have lower levels of affordability, lower levels of institutional capacity. So islands are extremely diverse in nature, and I think from a waste management perspective, it's important that we tailor the particular solutions to the actual setting. So Caribbean, what pertains in Caribbean, has to be tailored to the capacity, the affordability, and always I think we have to strive that what's pragmatic and what's robust in terms of trying to hit that key thing, which is sustainability. So a very mixed bag, and we have to be very specific in our approach within the islands.
Great, thank you. And Chris, could you talk about, do you have any follow-up to what Mike said, and also could you then talk about the differences between islands? I mean, the reason, there are reasons why we're talking.
Yes, I certainly
Waste
can.
management.
Yes, to add on to what Mike stated, certainly the islands are very diverse, without questions. You've got low-lying atoll islands, and you've got high islands, volcanic islands, very, very different in the way they were formed, and so you have challenges there with sole source aquifers, lenses of water, of drinking water that float on top of the seawater, and the climatic changes that are going to affect those over time. One thing I will say with respect to islands in general are the people. If there's one thing that I'd like to say that's in common with all the islands is they are resourceful and resilient. They understand the need to be sustainable and use the resources that they have on the island. They know better, I think, than anybody else what's it about to work with limited resources and to be able to maintain a sustainable island and use those resources for the long term. So I think you can learn a lot from their mindset about island communities and also their remoteness. I mean, they're very remote. They need redundancies in their systems, and they need to be self-sufficient as much as possible.
I think you're leading us to a point where in this day and age, islands are a good metaphor for the planet Earth. And everything you mentioned, the remoteness and being self-sufficient, all of them kind of apply to planet Earth. So wonderful that we could learn a lot from islands, and it just makes this panel more important.
Well, and if I may, if I may add, the conference of the parties that's meeting in Paris right now, I believe fully 10 leaders from the island nations in the Pacific are speaking at that conference to make that point. Those, especially the low islands, more than anybody, they are the vulnerable of the vulnerable. And to get those points across to the rest of the world about climate change and how it's impacting those island communities is very important and an important asset and a catalyst at the Conference of Parties in Paris ongoing.
Yeah, perhaps another point relating to the points that Chris made. From my experience in working in a host of islands, the challenges of being an island, perhaps being geographically remote, costs being enhanced by the need to import, export everything, equipment, indeed in some aspects waste. But interestingly, there's a slight, in fact a major challenge that many of the islands on which I've worked have to manage their waste problems, but the very economy on which the islands are based very often center around tourism. Now, which means that the environmental asset itself is worth that much more, and the touristic islands can ill afford to badly manage their waste because it's impacting on the very commodity that their economy depends on. So something of a challenge, certainly in the Caribbean, the Maldives, the Seychelles. Bad waste management, quite apart from health and the global environment, is very bad for the economy and very bad for business.
But Mike, I wanted to touch upon tourism, but not the point that you mentioned, which is very interesting. But won't what you mentioned be an incentive for them to, do better waste management as opposed to being a challenge?
It certainly, logically, is an incentive. But in many of the islands in which I've worked around the world, that logic, that incentive doesn't filter down to the operational level, which very much is constrained by the level of resources, the level of supervision, the operational framework, management supervision. So I think perhaps at a political level, at the touristic level, the incentive is there. More often than not, I don't see that incentive being translated into efficient and effective waste management practices.
Great. And Chris, do you have any points to add? And can you also talk about the problem of a floating population in touristic islands? The reason I'm mentioning that is once you have a floating population, it's unlike other places in the world where you could engage and educate a community, and then they will retain that for the next one generation and then pass it on. But when it's a floating population, you'll have to keep on educating them at a different level, a different pace. So can you talk about both what Mike said and about this?
I certainly can. I certainly agree with Mike that it's not filtering down. There needs to be, and they're working on, and the islanders are aware of it, a behavioral change and an educational change, not only in the community, certainly on those islands that get the tourism, but for also the tourists. It's an opportunity to educate the tourists as they come. They come to this beautiful island. They want it pristine. You got to get them to buy into. You're going to help that island too by minimizing the waste that you generate while you're on that island, and if they can get that through that to the tourism at the hotels, at the resorts that these people are visiting, it'll go a long ways for a behavioral shift for the tourism people that visit the islands, as well as the island community. I think the biggest, like Mike had mentioned, limited asset, limited resources, and limited space for this waste. There needs the first step certainly in the Pacific that they are aware of is about waste reduction, waste minimization, trying to not get it to the island to begin with. That is step one, and then of course is behavioral change.
And if I could add to that, we're talking about one component of island life, which is tourism, and the question you raised, Ranjith. But interestingly, in the Eastern Caribbean, tourism, I found as a practitioner, is actually an opportunity rather than a challenge. And I say that because the majority of tourists coming from North America and coming from Europe generally have a greater environmental awareness than the residents on the island. And they generally are used to highest environmental standards in North America and Europe. So I and others here have used tourism as an opportunity to raise levels of awareness amongst the populace, amongst the workforce, amongst the people in the waste management sector, and politically, to raise the levels of service to be commensurate with what people in North America and Europe would expect and appreciate. And it's also an opportunity in as much as Chris might have similar experiences, one of the biggest challenges in waste management, whether it's on an island, whether it's in mainland Africa, India, one of the main reasons waste management systems fail is a lack of cost recovery, that there isn't money in the system to reinvest in equipment. Even if you have international banks and donors building you a landfill and giving you a fleet of vehicles, very often my experience is 18 months later when they don't have the revenue or the experience in terms of maintenance, repair, replacement, things often break down very quickly. Now, in a touristic sense in the Eastern Caribbean, we use tourism as a potential revenue source, and we passed through Parliament and agreed throughout the Organization of the Eastern Caribbean that for every touristic visitor to the islands, something like $1.50 was charged on top of their ticket, specifically for an environmental levy. So the tourists themselves, when questioned, were happy to pay in the knowledge that that money that they were paying or spending was going directly to an environmental benefit. So that's the plus. The negative is perhaps poor political performance, poor political judgment, and trying to ensure that that revenue is spent on what it's meant to be spent. That's a whole different discussion. But in principle, tourism brings with it financial opportunities as well.
Great. I actually, we covered so much ground that I have multiple ways to, take this discussion. But a few things that what you said, a few things that I was reminded of based on what you said was talking about tourists being a positive reinforcement. This reminds me of a journalist, a French journalist traveling in India, and feeling helpless that she couldn't find a dustbin to put her waste in, or on the streets. So I think that clearly shows the the differences in environmental awareness that local people and tourists have. But other than that, let's talk about climate change, which is more imminent for islands, and I'm sure it has a lot of effects on how wastes are managed there and different projects. So maybe we could start a discussion on that. Chris, would you like to start?
Certainly, and if I can use Guam as an example, this road to better management of their solid waste, one of the aspects of that is climate change. To better manage the solid waste so that it doesn't become a detrimental impact to the environment. It was a detrimental impact to the environment before this change occurred in Guam. We had a dump that leached out leachate. Stormwater went through the waste and out into a river and out into the reefs. The reefs are a livelihood for many of the islanders. We had to make a change to that. And so that was the catalyst really to make the change on Guam, is to help the islanders helping themselves getting to a point where they get their house in order with managing their waste, to a point that Mike made about being self-sustaining. What we have done on Guam is have a system that is fully financed by the revenues that are generated by the operations. And so that's the kind of sustainability that needs to happen. It's fundamental. It's about collecting the waste. It's about putting it in, at least for Guam, a sanitary landfill. Also running a recycling program to get a waste reduction, so you're not sending everything to the landfill, and getting that off, and eventually getting that off island. For specifics with respect to climate change, you've got climate change. You've got a elevation rise in the oceans. That is going to have a detrimental effect on these aquifers of the islands, the low-lying atolls, which is it's a lens that floats on the seawater. As the sea level rises, you're going to have seawater intrusion into wells that tap that aquifer. That has an impact on Guam as well. Guam is a unique island where it's a high island, but it also has an uplifted reef system on the northern end, which is its sole source aquifer. It gets 80% of its groundwater out of that lens, and so as the water level rises, you're going to have saltwater intrusion at the perimeter of that. They're going to have to make some adjustments to their water supply system to counteract that. When it comes to waste management for the low-lying islands, a lot of the islands, because they don't want to put that waste on top of their aquifer, in the center of the island or a higher area of the island, it's typically along the edge of the water, or at the edge of the island, right in the seawater. So as you've got a water level rise there, you've got engineering challenges to safeguard that waste from polluting the reef system that it's adjacent to. So those are some of the challenges that low islands have, as well as the high islands around the world.
Mike?
Yeah, it's a very big topic. It's a very big topic, and it's one that I buy into entirely, climate change. But
Good to know.
at the level of the street, the guys on the street, it's a very abstract concept here. And people are more preoccupied with how they're going to put the next meal on the table or how they're going to pay their kids' school fees. So if I went out on the street and talked to people about climate change, it doesn't really resonate. What does resonate, however, is if you've got bad waste management, if the drains are choked with garbage, and the city here, for example, Castries, floods with monotonous regularity. People understand that. People understand that bad waste management equates to flooding, which impacts on their daily lives. People also understand, I think, at the level of bad waste management, impacts on health. We've got flies, rodents, mosquitoes. People make those linkages. So there's a pragmatic level of appreciation and understanding of the impacts of bad waste management. Also on the fishing communities, bad environmental governance generally, deforestation, sedimentation, impacts on their fisheries. So without doubt it's an issue, but climate change, I'd say at the moment, is a little bit of an abstract issue, and people are more readily buying into and identifying with the day-to-day impacts of bad waste management, which is a good starting point. And the more intellectual academic discussions can follow in due course once we get the basics put right here.
Right, and there are again many topics that we could go through, but one thing that was very interesting, which both of you alluded to, was a lack of cost recovery mechanisms. And I've seen this in India. Foreign aid starts a wonderful sanitary landfill, and within a few months, it's an open dump, back to being an open dump. So, Chris, I know you're the receiver in Guam. You know, you've taken over the waste management overall. What are your cost recovery mechanisms?
Setting appropriate rate. For the, and it is an appropriate rate that the people can manage with, that pays for the collection operations, pays for disposal at the new landfill. It also, once we got established a rate system and we're able to go out on the market for a revenue bond that was able to be obtained to fund the capital improvements, building that new landfill, and then closing the dump. It's primarily, it's revenue-based, it's based, and it's sustainable. We set it up so it is sustainable. It will take care of, current rate structure will take care of the post-closure care of the dump. It will also take care of future landfill expansion and closure of the present operating landfill. As well as the recycling that is going on to minimize the waste into the landfill.
Great. Mike, do you want to talk about cost recovery mechanisms?
Yeah, cost recovery to me is fundamental. It's one of the key components, and I find time and time again.
Mike, if I can interrupt you, so we have only another 25 minutes. So while talking about cost recovery mechanisms, and then, you know, which would be more illustrating to our audience.
Sorry, Anjith, you froze on me there. I didn't catch everything you said.
Sorry, I was saying, when talking about cost recovery mechanisms, can you illustrate some examples, you know, from your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I was basically saying, dissimilar from Chris's project, which sounds like Chris and his team have taken cost recovery on board, it's remarkable to me how after 30 years in the business, the big donors, the big banks keep getting it wrong. For example, I'm working in Ethiopia. One of the big development banks, I won't name them by name, are putting $500 million into regional landfill sites. Now this is Ethiopia, but there are lessons to learn. So something like 20 regional landfill sites, a budget of $500 million, not $1 for capacity building, not $1 for education, not $1 spent on cost recovery. They will absolutely, without question, fail. And it's a pattern that's repeated time and time again. Here in the Caribbean, we got it right from an engineering point of view. We got it right in terms of public education, awareness, capacity building. The one thing they didn't want to tackle politically was cost recovery. So the government bears all of the price, all of the cost. The economy of the Caribbean has gone down. The government can't make the payments now. So as a consequence, waste management levels of services are decreasing because of their inability to reinvest. I think on the islands, that specific politics on the island are very intimate, whereas in Western Europe, North America, politicians are at a distance from the electorate. On the islands, you have immediate access to the politicians. Politicians don't want to be seen to make difficult, unpopular decisions, and that pertains to cost recovery. They dodged the issue of cost recovery, which should have been a householder user fee. Some years later, they're ruining that decision, and they're finding they don't have enough money in the system to actually keep the system operating to the desired standards. Another very quick example that I'm doing in Sierra Leone, Congo, and also South Sudan is we're looking at models whereby we can charge for waste management as a percentage of other utility costs. So, for example, as a percentage of electricity costs, as a percentage of water utilization. And some countries, some islands, this model is working very well. That brings us to the next problem of good governance. It's one thing to generate the revenue. It's quite another matter to make sure the revenue is properly managed, transparency and accountability. I experienced that in India when working with hazardous waste. Revenue was being generated, but it was being filtered off nefariously, not going on what it should have. Same thing in Nigeria. You can generate the revenue. Making sure that revenue is spent appropriately and is accounted for is a whole different discussion.
And if I may add, I certainly agree with Michael on the islands. It's the same thing. It's been our experience in Guam when we got involved with the project and the solid waste and became the receiver. Fully one quarter of the people that were receiving service were not paying for the service, so they had a very poor collection program going on as far as collecting revenue. The money that did come in wasn't going toward solid waste and maintaining the system. It wasn't maintaining the trucks. They were renting trucks. They had one truck for the entire island of 150,000 people. You know, and it's a matter of priorities. You know, the government, you know, some of their first priorities are public health, the hospital, water, wastewater, fire and rescue, and police, and that sort of thing. And then you eventually get to solid waste. It was put off so long in Guam that the court finally stepped in and assigned a receiver and said, look, we're going to get this back on track. We're going to give it to this company, GBB, and right the ship, get it working again, and get it back to the government with the proper mechanisms in place. Again, managing the funding that Michael had mentioned, not letting it get tangled up in the general fund and getting siphoned off for pet projects and political projects and those sorts of things, but really funding what it should be funding, which is the management of the solid waste system.
Right, and I followed your the Guam project's updates, and I'm like very impressed with what you've done. So congratulations with all the progress that you've achieved on the island. And I think even Mike mentioned that you know you do take cost recovery on board. So that's
and I don't. It doesn't need to get to receivership. The islands have quite capable people if they have the appropriate technical support to get these things done, and the wherewithal to put the money where it should go and not get it siphoned off. The islands can do it. The people can do it. They just need some guidance, some technical support, and they can get the job done. It's just a matter of setting it as a priority.
Great. And now let's shift tracks. We have another 15 minutes to go. And let's talk about some of the solutions. And Chris, I'll ask you about if we can we ship materials in, can we ship waste out? And we had a short discussion. You could talk about that. But before that,
yes.
So can I go to Mike and then I'll come back to you? So Mike, could you talk a little bit about the costs of projects on islands as opposed to other places? and the kinds of technologies. We were talking about islands opting for simple technology. So can you just elaborate a little bit on that, Mike?
Sure, yeah. Waste management, I would say, is one of the most complicated and expensive chores undertaken, whether it's at the municipal level or the state level. That's as a kickoff. Put it on an island, and you've compounded those problems by all the factors of being an island, the physical isolation, probably the need for importing raw materials, expertise. So everything comes at an additional cost. So that compounds the original problem. Islands, volcanic islands, such as those in the Caribbean and also Seychelles, or indeed coral islands, as we have in the Maldives, there are problems with access to land, suitable land, as Chris talked about, impacts on aquifers. So many challenges. My starting point is always what is appropriate, what's affordable, what's robust. So in other words, what will be sustainable. Eastern Caribbean, a number of engineered landfill sites were built across the chain of the islands. Hasn't proved to be successful. And why it was not successful is because I would suggest that it's imposing on an economy, on a society, technology that was appropriate in Western Europe and in North America, but perhaps wasn't appropriate or sustainable within the island environment. And the reason I say that is I believe that wherever you are in the hierarchy, you have to make incremental improvements, stepwise improvements. And all too often, aid-funded projects try and make this utopian leap from point 0 to point 10, which might be from open dump sites to an engineered landfill site or God help us, an incinerator, but they make that leap and they arrive at that point 18 months later. But all the factors of sustainability, as I would call them, have been overlooked. So we overlook institutional capacity, public education, cost recovery, etc., etc. So we've talked a little bit about that. So for me, what works is incremental improvements and building in sustainability. In the Eastern Caribbean here, I've started a number of projects which are, my starting point is, if there's a dump site and we want to upgrade that to a landfill site, do it incrementally. Don't waste time and resources looking for a new greenfield site. They did that here in St. Lucia. 10 years later, they resolved where the landfill would go. 10 years of court cases and of protests. My starting point would be if you have a dump site, that's your starting point. Re-engineer, upgrade progressively. Fence, compact, cover, in situ leachate, using low-cost technology, whether it's reed bed, vegetational improvements, minimize the footprint, minimize the amount of waste exposed to the environment. That's step one. Then as you've improved your revenue base and everything else, then you can, in an engineering perspective, start to upgrade progressively. So that's my general rule of thumb, and I'm very wary of projects funded internationally that, as I say, go from point 0 to utopia in 18 months and don't address the sustainability. So my solution, in a nutcase, simplistically, is build upon all the factors of sustainability. Don't focus purely on technology, which I think is the failure of many of the international interventions.
Right, and I have multiple points, but I see, Chris, you want to talk about technology. But before that, let me just try to, people generally do not understand that waste management is an overall evolving system. You know, it starts, like you mentioned, starts at a point, and systems evolve together, different systems evolve together to get a final system. And Europe and the US, I think they've taken more than 30 years to get to where they are from open dumps, or sometimes more than that. And when it comes to foreign funding, though, the people who are funding kind of try to get those 30 years fast-tracked into 18 months, like you mentioned, I think, which is where the misunderstandings are. But Chris, please go ahead. You wanted to talk about technology, and then also talk about shipping waste out.
Yeah, if I could just follow up on Mike, I certainly agree with Mike. You need to start with the fundamentals on the islands, and they know this too. Many are still using open dumps, and so but I certainly would put getting your financing down, getting revenue in place as a start to support that change to move forward with proper collection, waste minimization, proper disposal. And if I may just want to mention, the Secretariat of the Pacific Environmental Program is an institution of 25 countries and territories in the Pacific. They have a waste management strategy, those primary goals of that is to do waste minimization, proper collection, proper disposal, get a start on the basics, and support that. And one size does not fit all. It has to be sustainable. And in most of these islands with much smaller community, much smaller financial resources, the fundamentals of waste management are what are going to take hold first, as well as the behavioral changes and the cultural changes. To touch on shipping waste and with respect to islands, let's say you have a collection program in an island. These islands are all very small. Unless they work together, it's very difficult to market that recyclable material or reuse it in such a way. And so, there's an opportunity here to work collectively, and the islands are aware of that too. Once they get these programs together and they have generated a recycling material, to get that off of the island, to get it to a market that's going to reuse that or repurpose that material, there's a need to work collectively. Really work like sort of a hub and spoke sort of situation where you have a hub, a central island, or a central facility that draws that material in from the other islands, and collectively, when you have enough of that material, it becomes economically viable to get that to a market to have it reused in a way. And so, in the islands, in Micronesia, in Melanesia, there's been discussion and looking into a waste processing ship, basically a mixed waste processing facility on a ship that goes to these islands, and the recyclables are brought to the port, and from there, it takes its route and gets back to places like Singapore and China, the near markets that can reuse this material. So those types of opportunities are being worked on. But again, step one is to get your collection, get your management of your waste on the island, and waste minimization is step one for many of them.
Great. Only 7 minutes to go, and I'll put a question where I'm expecting a very short response, which is about the basics in islands. And I've heard people say that Westerners are spoiled for choice when it comes to waste management options. But others working around the world, they understand that sanitary landfills, a good sanitary landfill is, extremely important for a waste management system. And so, starting in islands where they're generally dumping most of the waste into the ecosystem, where would you place your priorities? I mean, if you had $100,000 or maybe more, let's say an infinite amount, well, a finite amount of money, where would you put your priorities? Where would you put your money? Mike, I can start with you.
Yeah, prioritization. It's fundamental to make best use of the resources you have, whether they're home generated or whether they come as part of international aid. $100,000 doesn't sound very much, but it's a start.
I'm being cheap.
No, that's fine. Very often that's a reality. But in some of the smaller communities where I've worked at a community level, $100,000 could, I wouldn't want to spend it on equipment. I would rather spend it on capacity building, training, education, preparing the ground for the involvement of the private sector, for example. So in any given community, running appropriate bids, tenders, get the community involved with appropriate vehicle. In the first instance, it doesn't have to be a compactor. It can be a tipper. We can get the communities segregating the waste with education. And I find in a lot of these communities, low-income communities where revenue is scarce, across the globe, 50, 60, 70% of the waste is going to be organic. Now, a good starting point for me in many countries in which I've worked, waste segregation, compost the organic fraction, start making use of the bulk of the waste, tie that in with the local agricultural communities, and start to use some of the waste as a local resource. As Chris was talking about, island communities, trying to get recyclables to the marketplace is extremely difficult because at best it's marginally profitable, and it's very easy to do it and lose money. And just to touch on something Chris was talking about, we've actually done it and we continue to do it in the Eastern Caribbean, where we have barge-mounted recycling equipment, crushers and compactors barge mounting, and almost like a milk round going from island to island, focusing on, for example, car wrecks, compacting them, crushing them, and taking them off to Trinidad, where we have a regional hub, a regional market. So I'm meandering a little bit from the question there, but in essence, 100,000 or whatever your budget is should be invested in the basics, the factors of sustainability, and not, in my opinion, blown on expensive equipment and gadgets, which ultimately won't be maintained in the long run.
Right. Chris, short response.
I would agree. I would agree with Mike, absolutely.
Well, that's too short even for Twitter. But okay, so Mike, what you said was extremely interesting. So your initial investments would be in getting the community ready for these projects, as opposed to putting money into technologies, or maybe I think you're talking more about the private sector involvement, where private sector puts the rest of the money into the technology. Are we clear on that? Could you just confirm that in a minute?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Irrespective if you're talking about a small fishing community in the Eastern Caribbean, or where I've just come, northern Nigeria, cities of many millions of individuals, all suffering with bad sanitation. For me, the starting point isn't at the policy and planning level. The starting point is the community leaders, the community decision makers, engaging them, engaging the communities. What are their aspirations? What do they want? What is acceptable to them? And start working from the bottom up. And once we have community engagement, community mobilization, once people are in the schools and the communities are educated about the benefits, the cost of waste management, then we can mobilize the communities, we can start segregating, we can start doing appropriate private sector engagement. So it's very much a bottom-up approach, but having said that, we have to engage with policy and the decision makers and meet them halfway.
Great. We have another only 3 minutes, and we've already had a wonderful discussion, and I think we can continue. But before ending, I'd like to end this panel with by going into another very broad topic, which is plastics. So we have only another 2 minutes, but Chris, maybe you could start talking about plastics really quick.
A problem all around to deal with, a challenge to deal with, anywhere from banning them from getting out of to finding ways to keep them out of the waste stream. Multi-layer plastics are probably the most difficult, the one that more and more packaging as it becomes lighter, using that multi-layer films, and their problem as far as recycling opportunities.
Great. Mike?
Yeah, plastics, the scourge of the Caribbean and everywhere else that I've worked. You can start to make inroads, though. For example, again, not an island, but economically in many sense. In Sudan, I recently started a plastics recycling program, and it's about impact. Where can you have the impact? And I started working with the international companies that are importing and distributing Coca-Cola, Sprite, Fanta. These are the big generators. So we've got a fairly successful model in Sudan of dealing with the big distributors, saying you're profitable, what you do has an environmental cost. In terms of good governance and good stewardship, start investing in programs that recollect your waste, bring them back to the depots, process and export using the same communication hubs and the same communication lines. And that would be a broad approach that I would use here in the Caribbean or elsewhere. Start looking at where are the big generators and encouraging those generators to start acting responsibly. They're not going to do it without coercion, without education, without publicity. But those things build into it. For relatively small input, you can start to see quite a big output, and that's growing momentum in Sudan, and I'm replicating that in other countries as well.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris and Mike, for joining us today. And I think we'll have to end the discussion now. For our audience, so this discussion will be published on our website. It'll be available on YouTube immediately, but it'll be published on our website. In the summary, we will share links to what Chris is doing with the Guam project, and you can see step-by-step progress that they've made there. And we'll also share any publications that Mike has already, any reports that Mike has published on the summary too. So stay updated. And our next panel is on gender and waste management, a very new and interesting subject. So stay updated and follow us on Facebook and social media, and subscribe to our newsletter. So have a good day, good night, good evening. Thank you. Bye.